They said Gideon Hale was destroying his own house. In a way, they believed he was digging the grave for his entire family. And strangely enough, what they mocked ultimately became the thing that saved the whole valley during the harshest winter Montana had ever seen. Montana Territory, November 1891. The first time Gideon drove his shovel into the frozen ground right beneath the kitchen floor of his log house, his nearest neighbor, Caleb Morrison, leaned against the fence and watched him for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. "You know the ground down there is real wet, right?" he finally said. "Plenty of families have tried digging cellars in the Bighorns. The clay and meltwater will swallow everything whole." Gideon didn't stop. He kept digging into the cold earth, the shovel strike steady as if he hadn't heard a thing. "I'm not digging a food cellar." Caleb frowned. "Then what the hell are you doing?" Gideon leaned on his shovel, his breath steaming in the freezing air. "I'm building a place to keep the fire alive." Caleb laughed. A sharp, bitter laugh laced with pity. The north wind from the Bighorn Range blew so hard it rattled the porch roof, and Caleb's laughter made Eliza, Gideon's wife, eavesdropping in the kitchen, clench her fists in anger. "A wood cellar under the house floor," Caleb said, his tone so mocking that even his horse stamped irritably. "Gideon, you've got a proper cabin right above you. Thick walls, solid roof, big fireplace. What more does a man need to survive a Montana winter?" Gideon bent down and swung the shovel again. He didn't look at Caleb. But in those gray-blue eyes of the blacksmith was something men like Caleb would never understand. A man who had seen his family nearly die from the cold no longer trusted what had always been. And he knew sometimes to survive you have to dig deeper than others can see. Gideon Hale wasn't the kind of man who did things out of stubbornness alone. Before coming to Montana, he had been a blacksmith in Bangor, Maine, a trade that taught a man deep lessons about heat, wind, moisture, and especially the price of misjudging any one of them. In the closed forge, Gideon had learned to read the color of fire, to distinguish the crack of dry wood from the muffled sound of damp, and with just a touch on a log, he could tell if its moisture was 5% higher or lower. That skill had saved him many times until the day it didn't. The fire that year, when creosote built up in the chimney, flared into an unexpected blaze, burned down the entire forge, taking almost everything he had built over more than 10 years. Damp wood was the culprit. It released steam and thick smoke until the creosote on the chimney walls ignited like gunpowder. That failure followed him all the way as he moved his family west from Maine to a place where they said a man could start over without living forever with old mistakes. But Montana didn't grant easy beginnings. Last winter in the hasty cabin he had thrown up, the indoor temperature dropped to just 41 degrees Fahrenheit on some nights. His 10-year-old son Mason shivered under the blankets. Eliza sat holding him until morning, while Gideon, to keep the fire alive, had to break up the family's only table for firewood. He never forgot the choked sob from his wife when she saw the dining table turn to ash. From that winter on, Gideon began studying the ground. He noticed that when digging post holes, even though the surface was frozen, the layer about 5 feet down maintained a steady temperature year-round. That place wasn't battered by wind gusts, wasn't flooded by freezing rain, and moisture dropped sharply with natural airflow running east-west, typical of the Bighorn Valley. He understood to save his family he had to defeat the invisible enemy called moisture before defeating winter itself. And he promised himself, "I won't let winter break my family a second time." Yet the neighbors didn't see any of that. They didn't understand the thermodynamics the forge had taught Gideon. They only saw a man stubbornly digging deep under his log house on ground they believed the Bighorn Basin made soft and prone to collapse. In their minds, any void beneath a cabin was an invitation to disaster, cracking foundations, collapsing houses, landslides, and spring thaw. They didn't laugh at Gideon because he was foolish. They were afraid because he dared to do what no one in the valley had ever tried. Eliza was the only one who understood her husband's obsession. She trusted him, trusted those eyes that observed nature more than people, but deep down she still worried that Gideon was running from the past by throwing himself into a new, bolder, riskier idea. She knew the Bangor fire had never left his mind, and she feared if he was wrong this time, the price could be the very home they had just rebuilt. In the Bighorn Valley, where every family had to build their own roof, chop their own wood, and fight off blizzards themselves, the homesteader community formed a culture that was both tight-knit and conservative. If the old ways had kept their ancestors alive, no one dared change them. Because in this harsh land, one small mistake could become a death sentence. That's why when Gideon Hale started digging a cellar under his cabin floor, the valley's reaction wasn't just mockery, but fear mixed with panic. Caleb Morrison, the most respected carpenter in the area, who had built over 10 cabins and was seen as the Bible for all building principles, was the strongest opponent. To Caleb, any unproven experiment was an insult to the hard-won experience of previous generations. He believed the Bighorn foundation was soft, the thin ice layer beneath easily shifted, and any hollow under a house could cause the cabin to collapse during a spring thaw. Jonas Pruitt, a former cavalry soldier who had spent half his life in barracks and believed in discipline and order, couldn't stand Gideon breaking the norm. He joked insultingly that Gideon's digging an escape tunnel for his debts, prompting the Valley kids to follow the cabin and shout the man digging his own house's grave. At the Shell Creek General Store, where men gathered every afternoon for strong coffee and news, Gideon's idea became the week's laughingstock. They said only a failed gold digger would think of storing wood underground like buried treasure, that northeast winds would blow moisture in and turn the wood moldy, that sooner or later Gideon would have to beg wood from others to fix his collapsed foundation. In the corner, the women sighed in pity for Eliza, saying marrying an overly stubborn man means suffering for life, that Montana women already had enough hardship with snow and storms without living over a hole in the floor. But that opposition wasn't unreasonable. In frontier history, many families had tried storage cellars and failed. Bitterly toxic gases from sealed earth causing fainting mold, ruining food, walls collapsing in thaw, even children falling through stuck trapdoors. Those collective memories made everyone view Gideon's idea with suspicion. In that context, Gideon stood alone, trying to protect his family while facing ridicule, judgmental stares, and the isolation of someone daring to step off the beaten path. He knew every shovel strike challenged not just tradition but the valley's entire worldview. But he also knew if winter broke his family again, no one else would take responsibility. The community's conservatism wouldn't warm his cabin. Their fear of innovation wouldn't save Mason from bone-chilling nights. So even with the whole valley turning its back, Gideon kept digging because for him, faith in his family's survival mattered more than fear of judgment. Even as the entire Bighorn Valley doubted and mocked him, Gideon set to work with the meticulous care only a blacksmith accustomed to heat, wind, and moisture could possess. Before digging the cellar, he tested the soil the way Western pioneers did, squeezing a clump in his hand, dropping it from height to see how it broke, then using a drop weight test, dropping a small iron weight to hear the echo. A deep thud meant solid ground, a muffled sound meant soft or air-pocketed. The Bighorn soil was clay loam mixed with glacial gravel, cold but well-draining if sloped properly. After 3 days of testing, Gideon settled on a spot 90 centimeters offset from the cabin foundation to avoid structural impact, digging down to a more stable layer with no signs of seasonal thaw or shifting. Once the site was chosen, Gideon drew a 3-layer design, a sketch only he understood but packed with a lifetime of experience with fire, metal, and air. The first layer was drainage, a thick gravel bed sloped 2.8% southeast, enough for any moisture or wall seepage to flow to one point. The second layer was fieldstone walls, stones gathered from Shell Creek River, tightly stacked but with 2 small vent gaps for wind to pass through, creating low pressure to pull vapor out. The third layer was log reinforcement, horizontal and vertical timbers to keep walls from being crushed by earth pressure and thaw. The structure wasn't complex, but the combination of drainage, stone wall, and vents made it far more effective than any traditional storage cellar. Gideon understood clearly soil wasn't the enemy, just something that needed guidance to work properly. For the entrances, he chose 2 different accesses. One trapdoor right under the kitchen table, thick wood lined with dry moss and animal hide around the edges for windproofing. This let Eliza fetch wood each morning without wading through half-meter snow. The other was a gently sloped tunnel opening southeast, the direction opposite the strongest Bighorn winds. Every Montanan knew northeast was the deadly winter direction. Wrong cellar door orientation turned it into a snow trap, but southeast meant snow blew past, never piled up, always keeping the exit clear. Forge experience gave Gideon an instinctive feel for airflow. In confined spaces, he had adjusted vents, bellows, and coal placement to control pressure. That became an advantage in cellar building. He knew a precisely angled vent gap could change humidity dramatically. How pull and push winds worked where hot cabin air would collect. He tapped each timber with his hammer. A sharp ring meant good dry wood for moisture resistance. A dull thud meant still wet wood needing more seasoning. He rolled river stones in his palms, feeling surface chill to judge water retention. Yet behind that persistence was a fear that never left his mind, the Bangor fire memories of a smoke-filled forge, Eliza, screaming in the night his own helplessness as flames devoured a decade's work. He feared repeating that mistake. He feared leading his family into new disaster. So every stone placed, every timber nailed, had to meet one criterion: never in danger when fire is burning. And while Gideon immersed himself in every detail, outsiders saw only a strange sight, a man digging deeper under his own feet, day after day, regardless of howling wind. One night, as Gideon worked by oil lamp, placing the final stones, Jonas Pruitt climbed the fence, arms folded, looking down. "You're digging your house's grave, Hale," he said, voice cold as Bighorn Peak wind. Gideon didn't answer. He just kept placing the stone, exactly smoothing gravel around the edge as if finishing a new forge. Because he knew mockery wouldn't save Mason from the cold. But this cellar, if done right, could save them all. The first ice rain of winter arrived earlier than expected, like a test nature reserved for Gideon Hale alone. In just hours, freezing rain coated every roof, tree, and especially the outdoor woodpiles that Bighorn residents believed were safe under thick tarps. When Gideon stepped outside at dawn, he saw exactly what he had foreseen: every outdoor log encased in a 0.4-inch ice sheath, glistening in the dim winter morning light. He lifted one and immediately felt the added weight from deep moisture. If measured with modern tools, their moisture content would surely have hit 28 to 35%, enough to choke any stove with smoke before catching properly. Splitting one, Gideon heard the heavy, wet thunk, a sound his forge years taught him meant no warmth for a family. Meanwhile, under his kitchen, accessed by the trapdoor, a completely different story unfolded. When Gideon lifted the door and descended, gentle earth warmth rose, not hot but steady quiet. He lifted a log, weighed it, split it in two. The sound was sharp, dry, crisp. Pressing his ear close, Gideon heard the clear crackle characteristic of wood at ideal 12 to 13% moisture. That was the result of the vapor pressure differential he calculated, with the vent gaps cold, outdoor damp air couldn't enter, while internal moisture was pulled out and drained via the 2.8% sloped gravel southeast. In just the first weeks, logs brought down at 18% MC had dried gradually to near perfect for burning fast ignition, clean burn, high heat. Gideon had no scientific instruments. What he had were hands and ears trained in red-hot forges. He knew dry wood by its brittle metallic ring. He knew damp by its dull, tired split. And that morning the sound told him he was on the right path. But for the Bighorn Valley, the result wasn't enough to change prejudice. Passing the Shell Creek store, the men around the stove still shook their heads, hearing his cellar wood was drier than outdoors. "Wait," one said, "the snow hasn't really come yet." Another, holding strong coffee, added, "When a real blizzard hits, the ground will swell, water will seep, stone walls will collapse. Just survive a true blizzard and see." Rumors spread fast, as strange things do on the frontier, that Gideon was challenging nature, that his cellar would become a mud pit, that he was gambling his family. Some even joked that when the final winter storm came, the Hale house will be swallowed by the earth. But Gideon didn't argue. He just kept checking each log, adjusting vents, and doing what no one else in the valley would, preparing for winter with understanding, not hope. And deep inside, a quiet truth grew daily: if this cellar failed, his family would suffer first. If it held, everyone would eventually understand why he dug into the earth, instead of praying for snow to melt. But what happened in early December was the true test neither Gideon nor the Bighorn Valley would ever forget. The season's first blizzard arrived unlike any in local memory. For 5 straight days, the sky was torn by 6 0-mile-an-hour gusts, carrying dense snow that hammered cabin walls like sledgehammers. A total of 42 inches fell, burying every path, roof, and trace of life. Worse, between snow waves, 17 hours of freezing rain encased the valley in a deadly glass armor. Outdoor woodpiles, protected by cheap tarps, turned into frozen monoliths impossible to split, chop, or burn. Tarps ripped away in the wind, flapping into the forest like defeated flags. Chimneys clogged with creosote from damp wood smoke, forcing many families to sit coughing in sealed homes thick with damp and soot. At the Morrison place, where Caleb had been certain following tradition is enough for winter, the reality was grim. Damp wood kept fires sputtering out after minutes, leaving black smoke seeping through every crack. His 3 children coughed constantly, eyes streaming, huddled by the weak stove. Even tough Caleb began to panic as fire refused to obey. At the Pruitt house it was worse. Military experience didn't help Jonas fight cold that reached his bones. His fire died 5 times in one evening. Drinking water froze beside the stove. His wife trembled too hard to hold a teacup. Every time he split, a dry enough log moisture choked the flames, filling the cabin with blinding white smoke until it felt like a coal mine. Meanwhile, in the Hale cabin, a completely different world existed, one most Bighorn residents believed impossible amid the raging blizzard. When Gideon opened the kitchen trapdoor, gentle earth warmth rose, not hot but steady enough to feel life being preserved. His simple homemade thermometer of glass and grain alcohol showed the cellar stable at 49.51 degrees Fahrenheit despite outside cold making wind against wood sound like metal clashing. Gideon brought up an armload of wood, bone dry. He split one log. The crisp crack rang clear a sound any blacksmith recognized as life in wood. One match, strike, and flames caught instantly. No black smoke, no steam, no hesitation. The fire stood strong, bright, warm, as if burning on a summer day instead of in a whiteout storm. Eliza stood by the stove, hands on the warm surface, feeling heat she had cried for in past winters. As the kitchen glowed soft orange, she froze, then tears rolled unchecked. 2 years, and she had never felt their home. This warm, never-seen fire burned strong without choking the family with smoke. Never believed a valley-mocked idea could be the line between hope and despair. Amid howling wind and snow-lashing windows, Gideon watched the steady flames without a word. He knew the blizzard had days left. He knew his body still ached from long preparation nights. But he also knew for the first time in years his family had a real chance to survive winter, and all because he dared dig deeper, see differently, and trust laws others ignored. Outside the valley struggled against cold. Inside that small cabin for the first time, cold did not win. When the blizzard finally retreated after 5 days of destruction, the Bighorn Basin lay in heavy silence, as if the land itself was catching its breath. Many roofs sagged under ice weight, outdoor woodpiles were motionless, stone blocks and black smoke still lingered from Morrison and Pruitt chimneys like a reminder winter showed no mercy. Amid that, an unexpected visitor arrived, Jonah Whitford, surveyor and notary, who measured land and recorded homesteader living conditions for territorial records, visiting the valley only a few times a year. This time he came just when the valley needed an objective eye. Jonah carried a rare mercury thermometer, a thick notebook, and a handmade smoke gauge he jokingly called the fireplace's eye. Hearing all woodpiles were frozen, but the Gideon cabin stayed warm, he had to see for himself. His first stop was the Pruitt house. The large cabin was cold. After half an hour of struggling fire temperature, was only 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Jonah noted it, then observed chimney smoke, thick gray, sometimes black-streaked sign of damp wood. He tapped the stove, hearing unwanted sizzling evaporation. Asked how much wood Jonas Pruitt had used since season start, the answer was 3.8 cords, a number that raised Jonah's brow. Far above average, he wrote. Second stop, Morrison house. Caleb's cabin was cleaner, better-built stove, but the thermometer on the table read only 57 degrees Fahrenheit despite a strong fire. Chimney smoke was lighter than Pruitt's, but still cloudy, not the clear flue emission Jonah hoped for. Caleb admitted nearly 4.2 cords, used more than Pruitt despite a smaller cabin. Jonah added, wood burns fast but low heat. Major energy loss, moisture likely over 30%. Only when he entered the Hale cabin did Jonah see complete contrast. The moment the door opened, steady, pleasant warmth spread evenly, not just around the stove. Placing the mercury thermometer on the table, it stopped at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, so high Jonah double-checked for stove interference. No, the cabin truly was nearly 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than any other in the valley. He wrote warmest homestead in valley. Heat retention extremely high. Observing the Hale chimney, Jonah laughed in amazement. No black smoke, no gray. Just a thin, nearly transparent vapor, rare sign of high combustion efficiency. Almost forge-quality wood, he said, sniffing clear air by the chimney. Measuring Gideon's wood use, Jonah was even more stunned, only 1.1 cords, since season start nearly 4 times less than Morrison and Pruitt. Gideon explained briefly dry wood burns differently from damp, but Jonah, who had measured dozens of homesteads, understood deeper, damp wood wasted 30 to 40% energy evaporating water before true burning. That waste forced Montanans to burn double or triple needed amounts in winter. But Gideon was different. Thanks to vent gaps aligned with wind drainage, gravel bed, and stable 49-51 degrees Fahrenheit, moisture content dropped to ideal, nearly killine dried. Jonah flipped through pages comparing data for the 3 families, seeing undeniable difference. Pruitt, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 3.8 cords. Morrison, 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.2 cords. Hale, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.1 cords. The difference isn't luck, Jonah. Set eyes on the page, its design. News spread through Bighorn Valley in one afternoon. People said a man had beaten winter not by fighting it head-on, that he didn't resist snow but tamed the earth, that his wood wasn't magic but the result of understanding nature better than anyone. And from that moment, Gideon Hale's once mocked cellar was no longer a foolish joke. It became something the valley had to reconsider with curiosity, then amazement, then cautious acknowledgement. The shift in valley attitude didn't happen loudly like the earlier mockery, but quietly, cautiously, like snow melting on a roof on a slightly warmer morning. After Jonah Whitford's data spread through Bighorn, the first to appear at the Hale door was Caleb Morrison. Caleb wasn't the type to easily admit wrong, and that day he brought no apology. He just stood on the porch, hat in hand, wind-ruffling silver hair, and said, calmly, hard to read, "I want to see that snow-proof vent." Gideon took him down to the cellar without another word. Caleb bent close to the fieldstone, touched the tiny vent gap he had once called meaningless, examined the gravel bed slope and dry earth around the walls. He didn't praise, but his eyes softened. Carpenters like Caleb weren't easily convinced, but when they observed silently longer than a minute, it meant something. Jonas Pruitt arrived 2 days later. He stood by the fence, hesitant to enter. When Gideon opened the door, Jonas just nodded slightly, eyes averted as if truth unsettled him more than the blizzard. "I hear your place is real warm," he said quietly, voice hoarse from sleepless nights. "Can I see the cellar?" No one mentioned past mockery. No one recalled calling Gideon the man digging his house's grave. Gideon didn't either. He just let his neighbor down, as he would an old friend to shelter. Jonas touched the crisp, dry logs split. One heard the sharp crack echo in the warm space. He stood a long time, then said only, "Wish I'd believed you sooner." Upstairs in the kitchen corner, Eliza saw it all and understood the moment's meaning more than anyone. When Jonas left, she placed a hand on Gideon's shoulder and whispered, "The hardest storm wasn't the blizzard. It was public opinion." Frontier people thought nature was the greatest challenge, but they forgot gossip, suspicious looks, community fear were what truly isolated a person until suffocation. Now with those same people stepping into the once-mocked cellar, Gideon felt a different warmth, not from fire, but from quiet reconciliation with the place he was trying to belong to. And out there, after days buried in blizzard, the valley began looking at the little house on the slope differently, no longer with scorn, but with hope. By the time spring 1892 flooded the Bighorn Basin, the first warmth not only melted thick roof ice, but also melted prejudices that had weighed on the Hale family for months. Word of the never-damp cellar spread farther than Gideon could imagine. In the first 3 spring months, 12 valley families began digging cellars to his design, of course modified for each home, but the 3 core principles remained gently sloped: gravel for drainage, vented stone walls for moisture escape, and side door facing away from north winds. Those who had mocked him now stood on their own land, shovel in hand, recreating the model they once called madness. Gideon didn't claim to be a teacher, but he visited each home explaining how to choose proper river stones, how to measure slope with a weighted string, how to listen to wood to know ideal moisture. By fall 1893, Gideon's design was further improved by users themselves. Some families realized the dry, stable underground space could do more than store wood. Thus, dual-purpose cellars emerged, half for firewood, half for root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips. Some even hung meat in dry, cool pockets, areas kept a few degrees cooler by varied vent and depth design. These families found not only wood, but food lasted longer, spoiled less through long winters. By 1895, Gideon's method, now simply called the Hale method, locally spread beyond valley edges. Within a 40-mile radius of the Hale cabin, 23 homesteads adopted it, including larger ranches slower to abandon tradition. Some added air chimneys, vertical pipes to boost convection. Others built thicker stone thermal mass walls for winter heat stability. A few combined cellars with storm shelters for major blizzards. Each version evolved from Gideon's foundation but fit each family's land best. By then, the story was no longer about one man digging under his cabin, but a survival method born from real observation, something few valued in an era when people thought only scholars had right answers. The Wyoming Frontier Chronicle, in a long article on mountain survival techniques, devoted a full section to Gideon. It wrote, "One humble blacksmith solved a winter problem that scholars and engineers overlooked." Those words reached Cody Billings and beyond. But for Gideon, fame didn't matter. What he cared about remained simple yet profound this winter. For the first time in years, no valley family had to burn furniture to stay warm. The spread of the Hale method didn't just change how Bighorn Basin residents stored wood. It sparked broader discussion about how Westerners faced nature, and that discussion led to new awareness. Gideon Hale didn't invent anything grand academically. He simply observed nature more closely than others noticed. What everyone saw but no one paid attention to, then applied it with a blacksmith's skill for reading fire and air like his own language. Gideon knew soil retained heat because he had stood hours in forges dug into the ground to regulate temperature. He understood wind direction from opening and closing forge vents to control hot-cold pressure, and he trusted his instinct because it had saved him from workplace accidents too many times. But most importantly, he dared do what the majority called not normal. In frontier communities where life hung between survival and failure, crowds usually chose safety or what they thought was safe. They trusted ancestral experience because it was the only thing that hadn't betrayed them through many winters. Yet the West was never forgiving to those who only followed old paths. It rewarded those who dared step beyond limits, who experimented while others just watched. Frontier rewards the brave, not the reckless, but the brave who understand risk and still move forward because they see another way. The lesson from Gideon's cellar, therefore, lay not in any stone or timber he placed, but in the mindset he chose. Innovation doesn't need to be perfect, just right for the root of the problem. In Bighorn Valley, the problem wasn't lack of wood, but moisture-destroying burnability. Not that people didn't know how to light fires, but they had never thought storage was the root danger. Gideon saw that root, dug down to it literally and figuratively, and thus delivered a solution no one else dared try. For late 19th century Americans, reading nature was a survival skill. Reading wind to site homes, soil to farm, water for shelter, sunlight for time. But Gideon showed another level, reading laws others didn't think were laws. He realized soil could be enemy if feared, ally if understood and not forced. Looking broader to modern times, Gideon's lesson still holds value. Today's storage engineers know dehumidification, stable temperature, and airflow management are pillars of efficient storage. Off-grid living experts know Earth's natural heat can cut heating needs 50–70%. Architects studying passive temperature control know wind, soil, water, and light can heat or cool structures without energy cost. All those modern science advanced theory are retracing the path Gideon walked by experience and instinct, no paper or lab. And perhaps that is the beauty of the Hale method. It proves that sometimes to survive a harsh world, complex tools aren't needed. People just need to observe, think differently, and dare believe nature isn't something to conquer but to learn from. Where people learn, life finds a way. As talk of the Hale method spread beyond Bighorn Basin, what seemed just a moisture prevention technique became a symbol of how frontier people faced nature and their own fears. Then the next winter arrived, wind howling over Bighorn peaks, slashing the ground with white snow blades. Yet in that chaos, the Hale cabins still glowed warm golden light, piercing thin window ice, standing firm as proof of what an entire valley had to learn the hardest way. Some small ideas built with heart and persistence are stronger than any blizzard. Many years later, when asked what moment made her fully believe in her husband, Eliza simply smiled and recounted slowly, as if the memory still held warmth. The first time I stood by the fire and saw flames catch instantly. The time I didn't have to hold my son all night for warmth. The first time I saw in the eyes of the man the valley called crazy, not just stubbornness, but dignity restored. That warmth didn't just save us. It returned the faith the previous winter had stolen. For Eliza, Gideon hadn't merely built a wood cellar. He rebuilt family trust, restored his own honor, and laid the foundation for what Bighorn people later treated as truth. Innovation isn't betrayal of the past, but its continuation. 10 years after that storm, Jonah Whitford, the surveyor who had measured every degree and number in 3 cabins, sent Gideon a short letter. In it, he wrote, "I've traveled far from wind-torn Yellowstone valleys to freezing Colorado ranges, and I've never seen a system smarter than the Hale cellar. It proves that sometimes a blacksmith's finesse surpasses the theories of so-called scholars." Gideon kept that letter in a drawer until his death, not because he needed validation, but because he knew he had done what was right even when his entire small world denied it. And perhaps if one strong conclusion must be drawn from this story, it is Gideon didn't defeat winter. He defeated fear of change. Winter returns every year, but fear of change, fear of ridicule, isolation, being seen as contrary is what binds people longest. Gideon overcame it, and in doing so, gave the entire valley a new way to live. If you've followed the story this far, please leave a subscription so you don't miss other frontier tales, stories of ordinary people daring to face nature's most extraordinary challenges. And comment below, what was the coldest winter you've ever experienced? What helped you get through it? Those shares will help the story spread so more people understand that creativity and perseverance once saved generations before us. Finally, an important note, the story you just read is built on historical inspiration, frontier records, and real survival techniques. Characters and some events are fictionalized for educational, inspirational, and evocative purposes of the pioneering Western spirit. But the principles, moisture, drainage, underground storage, airflow control, heat preservation, have existed for centuries and remain valuable today. And just like the fire in Gideon Hale's cabin, knowledge only truly matters when passed on. Thank you for following to the end of the story. Please subscribe so you don't miss new inspiring journeys. See you in the next video.